Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking with David Burkus, who has just published his new book, Best Team Ever, The Surprising Science of High-Performing Teams. We're going to talk about that with great stories shared by David. Enjoy the conversation with David Burkus. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Business of Meeting podcast. And today I have the great pleasure of speaking with a thought leader, an entrepreneur, a speaker, a friend. It is his return on the podcast because he was here on episode 43 in January 2021. And the reason is that Mr. David Burkus has just published this book, Best Team Ever, The Surprising Science of High-Performing Teams. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about his life. We're going to talk about building teams, people and business. David, I'm so happy to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, no. Thank you so much for having me. I guess having me back, right? The first time obviously had to go well to get an invite back. But hey, no, I appreciate it. I think this is huge. Work is teamwork. And no one who's ever run a successful event, who's ever run a successful meeting knows that you can't do it alone. You're going to have to do a team to pull it off. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And I always like to, before asking you about your journey, to remind everyone how we met. And we met because you gave me my first lesson in jiu-jitsu.
Ah, that's true. Yeah. Mr. Krav Maga crashed the jiu-jitsu practice I was running at a conference we were both at, which it's still, I have only ever been to one conference that as a morning activity, that's getting more and more popular now. Let's do yoga. Let's do this or that. No one's ever done a combat sports morning workout session except for this one event. And they were nice enough to do it. So I ran the jiu-jitsu one. And then here comes this guy who took to jiu-jitsu okay, but kept trying to claw everyone's eyes out. It was just weird. But apparently in a fight, you go back to what you know. And so Eric went back to his Krav Maga.
Yeah. And that was all thanks to Jason Gaignard in MMT. So thanks for reminding that. David, you have been, and I've been following you for years. I love your thinking, what you're writing. You're an amazing speaker, very energetic. How did that start?
Being an amazing speaker and energetic? Well, thank you. It started just now when you said that. No, how far back do you want to go, right? So I was an undergraduate English and creative writing major. 17-year-old me wanted to be a writer, right? When you're that young, you think books are fiction or textbooks, right? The concept of like nonfiction outside of textbooks doesn't exist to you because you're an idiot 17-year-old. So went into university thinking, I want to study English, want to write literature, want to write novels, right? And then the curriculum forces you to take a variety of different classes. And the ones that were more long-form journalism, telling true stories, science writing, et cetera, all of those classes were more fascinating to me. And the books that were using storytelling, but telling stories that were true, we might call them case studies, right? But not, because case studies are boring and stories are captivating, using storytelling and then blending that with insights from science, but particularly social science, was just fascinating to me. And so I came out of university thinking, hey, this is what I want to do. I want to write these types of books. The problem is I didn't have a degree for that. Didn't know anything about organizational psychology and social science other than what I had read in the books. So I decided to go on and get a master's degree, first part-time. And my wife was in medical school at the time. So we had a lot of study dates. And when my master's stopped, I graduated and she had more school. I was like, well, let's keep going. And I entered into a doctoral program. I had no intention that would turn into adjuncting in evening executive MBA programs and then later getting a tenure track position and becoming a business school professor for like a decade. I had no idea any of that would happen. The goal was just to write this stuff. And the more it became useful, the more the requests to speak from outside came, right? So I guess, professors, fundamentally a professor, like a traditional MBA professor, the way those classes are taught, you're essentially a speaker, right? You are automatically. And a lot of your student surveys and things like that are essentially how captivating and relevant and what have you a speaker you can be. Right. So in a way, I guess it was a sort of natural transition into that. That is now, I still put these books and the ideas in the books at the center of kind of my life or business model or what have you, but it's really driven by speaking at events. And so What I like to say is I was a business school professor and I just traded the classroom of MBAs for the for boardrooms of executives. And here we are.
Very nice. And when did you make the final leap? Because I suppose that you didn't come home one night and said, I'm not going to be a professor anymore. I'm going to be a speaker.
Yeah. I mean, gradually first, then all at once, right? Like whatever book that's from. No, it's a famous line about like I went bankrupt like everyone does, slowly at first, and then all of a sudden I just forget what book it's from. See, that's my now you know how long ago it was that I actually studied literature, right? Because I can't remember what book that's from. 2016, my second book came out, and that was sort of a survey of practices and policies in business and sort of a future of work book. And so that got me really, really busy. By 2018, I was already scaling down how often I was teaching less than a full load for a tenure track and switching, not doing a lot of academic research, but doing more of the speaking and consulting. And then COVID was really the catalyst for the big jump, right? I was still teaching during COVID and taught a little bit during COVID. But then what ended up happening was every private institution had a little bit of a cash crunch. Students didn't want to come back and pay exorbitant amounts to go to school online. I get that, right? And so when faced with all sorts of the different financial pressures, I was like, look, I don't need this. If there's a professor who can stay full time, you don't like it. I don't need to be here. So I stepped out fully kind of in the recovery to COVID and focused in. It also happened that's when Leading from Anywhere, the book that we were on for episode, whatever, came out. And I just got busier with that. So it was, gradually at first and then all of a sudden.
So when you wrote Leading from Anywhere, we're in the middle of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where the idea of Best Team Ever started, or something much after?
Yeah, I would say it started when I started working with organizations specifically on concepts and Leading from Anywhere. So not while I was writing the book, but when I was talking about the book and working with teams on it, because the realization, it was a COVID realization to me that most people's experience of work is less shaped by their company culture than by their team culture, right? Whether or not you're engaged, whether or not you enjoy your job, whether or not you become a high performer, all that has a whole lot more to do with teams, especially now. I mean, it was true before, right? We always used to say people don't quit bad companies, they quit bad bosses. In other words, they quit the bad experience they're having on a team level. But especially during COVID and in this future of kind of hybrid work, it's more true than it was pre-COVID, that it's less about building company culture and more about training every leader at every level to be chief culture officer of their team so that their team can become a high performing one. So that was what got me in really focused on, this is about the team. This isn't actually about the macro, how an organization survives hybrid. In order to equip every manager with what they need, we need to teach every single manager to shape their team's culture, because that's going to affect their performance more than anything else.
I totally understand that. And I was listening to it. I was thinking, but can we have a bad culture in a company and great small team culture?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want an example of that, I don't know how much you've been following the group that helped your book and my book come into fruition, but Scribe Media, started by a good friend of ours, taken over by a different person who apparently, once they started to have financial troubles and lots of stuff went really bankrupt, turned out to be at the senior level a horrible place to work. And yet, as it's imploding, there are certain core people who are still super engaged in serving clients, who are still super connected together. So there are very clearly, like, you look at that organization and there are very clearly pockets of teams that were really great and people that want to stick together and still do work, even though the overall company culture wasn't what it appeared to be. And we see that in multiple different organizations. I think you go the opposite way too, by the way. There are companies that win all sorts of awards for great place to work, and one manager runs their team specifically toxic and people want to head out. So it happens in both ways.
Great answer. When you start the book, and it was fascinating to read about Team Reject, the curling team in the US. And this is a story that spans in the course of 8 years.
No, I mean, really 12 if you add the epilogue of the 2022 games.
True.
Right? Yeah.
So can you tell that story? Because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah. So Team Reject, USA Curling, if you're one of the 17 people in the United States who love curling like I do, I don't actually, but I do find it fascinating every single Olympics. then you probably got to know quote unquote Team Reject in 2018 because they were Team USA and they won the first Olympic gold in curling for the United States ever. Curling is a sport dominated by Canada and the Nordic countries. Actually, that's true of just about every winter sport, isn't it? I just realized that.
I'm sorry for interrupting you. Living in South Florida, we just lost the final against the Knights. So in ice hockey, you can tell that a team from a city in the desert beat a team, a city by the sea.
Yeah, well, and all of them beat teams that were based in actual Canada. But anyway. So USA Curling. I mean, the challenge with Team Reject, though, is that the reason they're called rejects is they were rejected from USA Curling. So John Schuster, they won in 2018, but they went in 2014 and they did terribly. They choked. They finished horribly. They also, most of the members of John Schuster, the leader, most of the members of his team also were part of the 2010 collapse where Schuster himself choked, right? So what you had was this team, this group of men who failed in 2010, failed in 2014. And then at the end, after 2014 games, were told, we're really focused on winning for 2018. So we're going to set up a high performance program to poach athletes from other sports, teach them curling and hope that their athleticism, their talent, their latent talent, hope that will turn us into having a better shot of winning the Olympics. And so, John, you're not invited. Matt Landsteiner, you're not invited, right? Chris Plythe, you're not. None of you people who choked are invited. They didn't take kindly to that. So what they decided to do was they decided to train themselves. They donned this moniker Team Reject, where the people who were rejected from USA Curling's development program, but we're going to train ourselves. We're going to train each other. We're going to fund our own way to competitions. And little by little, it started to work. So much so that before the 2018 Olympic Games, they won the US Olympic trials. So they had won the right to go represent, USA Curling, to go represent the United States in 2018. And that's really where I focus in and why I opened the book with this story. It's not because I love curling, because I don't. I actually don't. I only know, I had to learn a ton about it to write about the story. And it is fascinating, but I watch it once every 4 years, like every other American. But it's because USA Curling's dilemma is every leader's dilemma, right? You're charged with building the best team you can, the best team ever. And a lot of us rely on talent and try and predict like who we can put on the team to make it the best team, instead of paying attention to culture and paying attention to what changes were made. I mean, the team got healthier when they were working as Team Reject. They were more motivated by that rejection. They had to coach each other, so they got a deeper understanding of each other. So what changed from 2010, 2014, and 2018 with the members of Team Reject wasn't that they got more skilled. They were already skilled enough to represent the US. It was them as a team, their bonding as a team, that kind of held them together. And they became the best team the USA has ever fielded. Actually, it's not called a field in curling. It's called a sheet. So I guess the best the USA Curling has ever sheeted out to the Olympics. And nobody would have predicted that. Everybody was predicting another disaster. And that's that challenge with teams, right? It's so we look, and you could pick your sport. This happens in other sports. This happens in business all of the time. Teams of superstars collapse, and underrated teams of would-be players succeed. And so I was so focused in on trying to explain why that is. And Team Reject's a great example of sometimes you have to look deeper into how the team's interacting and the culture that they're building to find that explanation. Then it turns out that tends to be the explanation for almost every high-performing team.
The tagline of the book Best Team Ever is the surprising science of high-performing teams. So what is the surprising science part?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that are really the big surprises for me in the book. The first we've already sort of hit at with USA Curling, right? And that is that talent doesn't make the team makes the talent. The changes you make to team culture are the difference between whether or not you unlock latent talent and turn it into performance, or whether or not you just trust that talented people will figure it out, right? Talent is like gasoline. It's packed with energy, gasoline, but it needs a system to go through of combustion in order to turn that energy into something useful. It needs an engine. Teams are kind of the same way. Talent is latent in individuals, but to turn talent into performance requires that team, right? So that's surprise one. Surprise two for me is just how common the same elements of team culture keep coming up, right? I'll show my English major chops again, and this time I remember the book. Leo Tolstoy has that book, Anna Karenina, opens with the famous line, all happy families are alike, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own unique way. I have no idea if that's true for families, but it's true for teams. High-performing teams are all alike. Every dysfunctional team is dysfunctional in its own unique way, but high-performing teams consistently have the same three things in common when you look at their culture. And that's kind of makes the whole structure of the book of those three themes.
Awesome. So those three things are common understanding, psychological safety, and pre-social purpose.
Pro-social. Yeah, you could call it personal. I mean, we can dive into that too. But yeah, common understanding, psychological safety, and pro-social purpose.
So in the common understanding, you divided into clarity and empathy. Can you give us example of, obviously we're not going to go to the whole book today, but just to illustrate the point about clarity and empathy.
Yeah, and you could also think of these. I didn't want to call it like common understanding is clarity of tasks and clarity of people, but that gets hard to remember, right? So we use this word empathy instead. It's how well team members have this sort of, some research literature refers to it as a shared understanding, but how well people understand what's expected of them, sure, how well they feel like they're capable of doing what's expected of them, how well they trust that other people are going to do what's expected of them on the team. And so all the pieces are going to fit together. That's task-based. That's what we call clarity, right? But then there's people. And so I call it empathy a lot of times because it's about understanding their differences in preferences, their difference in the context they want to work in our ever-changingly hybrid environment, right? You could call this personality differences too, although I find that like personality is on a team, personality differences matter only so much as they influence people's work preferences, right? I don't need to know, Eric, that you're an INTJ. I need to know why your emails are so short and you would rather talk instead of write out your explanation to me, right? Like that's what I need to know. So I need to know those differences in work preferences. I need to know what mediums of communication people receive. I need to know how people like to receive feedback, right? Or what a request for help looks like, you know? Yeah. And so we call that sort of empathy, clarity of tasks, but also how clear we are on the people that we're working with and how we can read those little nonverbal signals and how well we can pick up on or how well we remove taken for granted assumptions about how we're supposed to operate as a team. And we actually have clarity about how each of us want to operate as a team so we can serve each other accordingly.
When you're talking about that and talking about, how you're going to get the communication, getting the feedback, I had this thought about, challenging conversation, tough conversation.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that in many cases, people said we need to be able to have difficult conversation until we actually start having difficult conversation.
Yeah. And, this is an area that really comes up in that second element, psychological safety, right? Because people will say we need to have those difficult conversations. We need to trust each other. And yet the work they're not willing to do is to create a space where it's safe to take risks, right? And risks here not being like to go YOLO with company money or something like that. I mean, interpersonal risks. The risk of speaking up and saying, Eric, I don't agree with you. I think that's a dumb plan, right? I wouldn't put it that way, but because we're friends, I'll call you dumb. Or, Eric, here's my crazy idea for what we could do. I'm just sort of spitballing, or even just, hey, I screwed up. I made this assumption about what the client wanted and the client hated it. And now they're going somewhere else. All of those are forms of risk taking. And that's what we actually want about difficult conversations or crucial conversations. We want to create a space where people feel safe enough to have those conversations. And the key for that is not a level of trust. The key for that is what we do after the risk. Do we respect them after the risk? Do we listen to that person who disagrees with us, even though we want to just jump in and correct them? Do we listen and help them feel heard first and then engage in a dialogue, or do we just try and shoot them down? Do we hear that crazy idea? Do we say that'll never work because we don't have the budget, or do we hear it all out and then we go, okay, well, have you run a cost estimate for that? I'd love to hear more about what you think it would cost. Or same thing, same end result. We might find out that the crazy idea is crazy because it's too expensive, but telling them that doesn't make them feel heard. Helping them find that, responding to that risk. Do we draw the lessons out from the failure, or do we just sort of, use that failure as a reason why, well, maybe you weren't ready for this role, right? How do we respond when people admit those failures? It makes a huge difference in whether or not we do that, and a huge difference in whether or not we build that sense of psychological safety.
Mm-hmm. I always think that, psychological safety, there is no safe space. There's only safe people.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I agree. And I'll tell people psychological safety is not about building safe spaces. It's about teaching people to respond with respect when risks happen, right? About teaching people to be those safe people. Psychological safety actually means the opposite, right? If you think about safe spaces, you think about places where you're never going to encounter ideas you disagree with. This is actually totally the opposite. This is where you're going to find those ideas. You're going to encourage people to have those things you disagree with, and you're going to be trained in how to respond to them properly, right? So it's almost like not only are you creating safe people, you're making each individual person stronger, building out what you might call it a growth mindset in every individual as well.
Mm-hmm. I can't help but think when I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about the cancel culture, and I'm thinking about people that have their own dogma, and I'm thinking about the divide in society. How do you create such an environment where I can be disagreeing with you and I'm not afraid to say it, and you can be disagreeing with me and you also have the honesty not only to tell me but to do it in a way that it's better for the organization?
Yeah. And I think about this all the time, not only in cancel culture, but like 2023 is sort of like the year of the corporate blunder, right? And I won't get into specifics and I won't name names, but there's so many different examples of organizations essentially offending their customer base, right? Mm-hmm. And I think about that as a psychological safety issue, right? Because what that actually means is at no point in hindsight, it looks obvious. How could you have thought your customer wanted this when they really want that? But what it actually is it tells me somebody, usually towards the top, had this idea and no one underneath them felt safe enough to raise their hand and be like, oh, I don't know that jives with the values of our primary target audience, right? That no one felt safe enough to speak up and go, hey, actually, I think this might be a bad idea. And here's why, right? That's the only way you get all the way to some of these things actually rolling out, is you don't have enough safety in the organization for people to stand up, right? So to your question, how do you build that? Well, it really comes down, again, like I said, to that respect piece. Christine Porath, the world's most respected researcher on respect and civility in the workplace, she cites, out of all of her studies, decades of research, the number one reason people are uncivil to each other in a workplace is they're modeling the behavior set from leadership, right? So how should leaders respond? That's a great question. Well, I think you start from an assumption. You recognize that everyone's conclusions are logical to them, right? Everyone is like, we love people who agree with us because clearly they're brilliant, but everyone's brilliant. Everyone's brilliant. What they're doing is they're looking at the world as they see it with their set of assumptions, and they're making what's a logical conclusion, right? And so the fact that you disagree with them doesn't mean they're illogical and you are, or you're illogical and that. It means clearly you inputted things into the formula differently. You had a different perspective. You made different assumptions. That's why, like I used the budget example, right? Your idea might seem perfectly logical, but you might be assuming we have a whole lot more or a whole lot less resources than we have. So we don't have a difference of opinion per se. We have a difference of assumption. And so when you start from that perspective, you realize that, like, okay, I disagree with you, but the reason I disagree with you is we should actually back up a couple steps and we should see, are these things true? Like, my favorite question, I tell every leader I get the chance to say this. When somebody says something they want to take a course of action you disagree with, they want to implement a plan, their suggestion, their crazy idea, whatever it is, simple response question. Hey, that's a really interesting idea. I wonder, what would have to be true for us as a team to know that should be our option? What would have to be true? In other words, you tell me the assumptions you're making. What would have to be true? We'd have to have this amount of money. We'd have to have this timeline to pull it off. We'd have to have this many, free people to dedicate to the project. Let's go explore all of those assumptions. Because if we disagree, then what that means is that we didn't explore those assumptions ahead of time. And so we're both operating from different sets of assumptions. And when you do that, like, that's humbling, right? You won't find common ground. Like, you probably won't find a plan everybody can live with. If you did, everybody will be equally miserable. Yeah. What you'll do is you'll coach people into realizing, oh, I was wrong. Hey, I had the wrong assumptions. And that's okay, because my perfectly logical, really smart brain next time might have the right set of assumptions, right? And so you start to get people less territorial over their ideas, because you realize that all I'm doing is extracting logically from the world as I see it. And that picture might be wrong from time to time, but other times it'll be more accurate than anybody else on the team. So we all win some, we all lose some, but we do it in the service of making the best decision as a team.
I was told once that the three most difficult word to say is, I'm sorry, I love you, and Worcestershire sauce, which is difficult to pronounce. Now, the first one, I'm sorry. How many leaders have the courage to simply say, you know what, I was wrong, or I'm sorry, and basically create that environment where people are okay to express a different opinion?
You know what's funny? Not enough, first of all. And what's funny is I've almost given up on coaching leaders to say that.
Wow.
Right?
Why?
And here's why. I would much rather them say, I don't know sooner in the process.
Yes.
Than have them pretend to know and then have to say, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, that for sure.
Yeah. So that'd be my word. Like there's so much power in the phrase, I don't know, for building psychological safety, but also to avoid making it's dumb, preventable mistakes a lot of times. But I think that's the thing. We end up having to say, I'm sorry, because we didn't listen enough to other people and we did what seemed right in our own eyes and turned out to be wrong. And if we had the courage to say, I don't know sooner, we probably would have avoided the mistake to begin with.
Absolutely. And I can't help but smile because that's one of the cultural differences I witnessed when I came from Belgium 10 years ago. I would ask my way. So should I go left or right? And the person would say, I'm not sure. So what do you mean not sure? Pick a guess. Tell me left or right. I'm not sure. And it took me a while to understand that here, I'm not sure means I don't know, where I would just simply say, I don't know. There was something like it's not okay to say, I don't know. I didn't get it.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly in larger organizations for sure, right? Like most people got into their first leadership role because they had the answers more often than everyone else, right? Because they were smarter, because they performed better. And so what that creates is this feeling that if I want to keep going up, I need to keep being right more often than the rest of the people at my level. And so you end up with people at the top who are usually clueless, but unwilling to admit it. And in reality, when we can, like, especially for a struggling organization, the best thing they could have is a leader that's like, okay, I don't really know. I got to get a picture of what's going on. Can you help me?
Great point.
Right? That would be the best thing.
Absolutely. So the first point was, the first part was common understanding. The second one was psychological safety. And the third one, it's a pro-social purpose with meaning and impact. What example we have for us?
Yeah. So pro-social purpose is a little bit, it's like purpose plus, if you will. Maybe 10, 15 years ago, we all, especially in the United States, but in the West, started talking about purpose more often in organizational life. We were told we need to, start with why, which is no problem with any of that. No problem with why. I'm not looking to like poke somebody in the eye over that. But the problem is that a lot of leaders in an attempt to write a compelling why just ended up rewriting a mission statement that, blah, 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 shareholder value, blah, 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 integrity, innovation, blah, 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 right? And that doesn't motivate anybody. What most people are motivated by is a feeling that they're making a meaningful contribution, meaning towards work that impacts others, impact. And the answer to that isn't actually why. The way to answer that is to answer the question, who? Who is served by the work that we do? Who are we actually doing this for? This is why, I'll give you an easy example. This is why every nonprofit in the world knows they don't give you statistics about the problem. They tell you stories about people who are affected by it. Same thing if you're trying to motivate people in organizations. Don't give us statistics about growth or shareholder value increases. Don't even focus on here's how we're disrupting the industry. Tell us specific stories about specific people who are helped by our work, and we will be far more motivated, number one, to work individually. But number two, you see a dramatic increase in what are called organizational citizenship behaviors, fancy organizational psychologist term for teamwork. People are more likely to put themselves second and put the team first when they know that team's work is serving not a greater good is great, but a specific person towards that greater good.
And all your research, David, have you found organization, companies that actually exemplifies those three parts?
Yeah, I found two different ways, right? I found companies that exemplify it consistently. And then I found ones that saw massive spikes when they switched to it. So like in the book, we unpack KPMG, which was an accounting firm that from 2014 to about 2016 2017, was engaged in this powerful way of helping people reframe their work as serving specific people. And it was really powerful. They don't really do it as much anymore. Actually, if you want to get into accounting, I'm a much bigger fan of what EY is doing with this whole personal purpose curriculum that every individual in the company has a chance to go through to figure out because purpose is personal. But then there's enduring great ones. WD-40 company under Gary Ridge's leadership has really, they sell oil in a can, and yet they collect these stories of the way, if you've ever had a squeaky door or some other problem you can't solve, and you're like me, and like you have your entire toolkit is a toolkit from IKEA and a credit card, because if you can't solve it with that hammer and pliers and whatever else from the IKEA toolkit, then you should call someone because you're out of your league. That's me. But you know what I can do? I can spray 2 squirts of WD-40 in that door hinge, and now I'm a hero. And that's what like WD-40 would tell you. Like, we make heroes out of people, right? And I believe that. And then our mutual friend, Jesse Cole, the Savannah Bananas organization, right? Which is actually, not a lot of people know this, the legal name of the entity that owns the Savannah Bananas is called Fans First Entertainment. And that's really what it's about, serving those fans. They'd make a lot of decisions based on what's best for those specific fans. Jesse, the founder of it, our friend, is on a mission in his mind to save baseball. Because if you're a 9-year-old kid, Major League Baseball is boring. And if you're a parent of a 9-year-old kid, Major League Baseball is like a Ponzi scheme. They just keep asking you for more money at every step of attending a game, right? And so they come in with flat pricing, with something that's far more entertaining for the kids. And that's what they want to create, is that environment that serves fans, but towards the larger goal of keeping kids interested in America's pastime of baseball, right? Yeah. And they've never forgotten that. I've seen them since I don't know how long you've known them, since I've gotten to know them. I've seen them explode from a summer college player staffed team that only ever plays for 3 months in the summer to one that is selling out stadiums in the tens of thousands, right? On 30 different cities a year on tour among 2 different teams, and only going rapidly. And you see that because every player, this happens. I just went to a game. They came to my town a month ago, and we went in for the signing. Every player stays afterwards to sign fans. One guy, I love this. You line up to go get autographs. Like, my kids are in line to go get autographs for the team. And one guy has a Sharpie and he hands it to every kid and goes, "Hey, sign my jersey." And then he plays with that jersey the rest of the night, right? And all of the kids are going, "That's the guy, my signature's on that guy's jersey." Like, that level of being so focused on, we're not here to win games. Winning would be great, but we're here to serve fans. We're here to create an entertaining experience for families. And when we want to motivate our people, those are the same stories we tell to the rest of the team, are those individual moments, like the guy with the jersey getting signatures from kids.
That's a great stories. And I think that every 20 years, there's a story like that. It was Ricardo Semler with Semco in Brazil, years ago. And now there's Jesse Cole and the Savannah Bananas, which, by the way, it's episode 152 on this podcast, if you want to listen to it. But he is phenomenal. And if I remember by heart what he said, he's got like 3,000 people on the wait list to work for them.
Yes.
And he's got 500,000 people, and 500,000, repeated, 500,000 people in waiting list to buy a ticket.
Yeah.
It's insane.
And meanwhile, Major League Baseball can only fill stadiums in October, opening day, and then October.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's very inspiring. Any other example, like the one of Alan Mulally when he first came to Ford? I thought it was great with the Lexus answer.
Yeah, and this is, if we want to go back away from purpose, back to psychological safety and saying, I don't know, and I need to have an honest conversation about where we are. This is a great example, right? So Alan Mulally was tapped by Bill Ford, great grandson of Henry Ford, who, let's be honest, it actually takes a lot of courage if you're the great grandson of Henry Ford, to step down and say, I am not qualified to run this company in its current situation. I'll give him some credit, right? Mm-hmm. And he chose Alan. He helped the board choose Alan to replace him. And Alan was committed to, we need to call the situation as it is, in a culture where everyone was supposed to always have the right answers. The year Alan took over, they were set to lose $17 billion. Like, imagine telling your investors, your shareholders, hey, if everything goes according to plan, we'll lose $17 billion. What kind of plan is that, first of all, right? But Alan knew that's what you get when you have a culture of people who are always pretending to have the right answer, right? And so Alan knew we need to actually get at what the truth is. And so he started doing these regular meetings, the business plan review, the BPR, every Thursday morning, 7 a.m., Thunderbird conference room. And they would go over 320 metrics that would track Ford's success, right? And everybody was responsible for their own numbers. Like, it's not one person with 320. Everybody has their own, but collectively, 320 different metrics. And to make it easy, because that's a lot of different metrics, he asked everyone to color code their slides when they presented them. A green slide would mean everything's on plan. Yellow would mean we're off plan a bit, but we've got a plan to get back on plan. And a red would mean we're clueless. Like, we have this problem and it needs to be addressed and we don't know the answer, right? And so their first meeting you should always have the answers. You should be, you shouldn't be vulnerable. You should be invincible culture that Alan inherited. Their first meeting, there were 320 green slides. Every single metric, everybody, if I was responsible for it, I'm saying it's green. I'm saying we're at plan. I'm not going to be the one to get vulnerable and admit I'm failing. Next week, same thing. Week 3, 320 green slides. Week 4, 320 green slides. Same thing over and over. It wasn't until week 9. And so much protesting from Alan that, like, we can't manage a secret. That was the term he started using a lot. We need to be open and honest about this. It wasn't until week 9 when one executive, Mark Fields, turned his slide red. And truthfully, I think this is funny. He did it because because of production problems, they were going to have to delay the launch of the Ford Edge. And his team that was helping him get ready for the meeting tried to convince him to keep his slide green, right? You don't want to be the first green. And, we know the problem. So maybe that means, right? Yeah. But he decided, no, this sounds like this is what Alan's been talking about. So he turned his slide red. And, that first meeting, Alan talks about it all the time. That first meeting, week 9 of a red slide, the room just was dead quiet. And everybody was staring at Mark Fields. Like, what's going to happen next? Is a hole going to open up in the floor? Are 2 security guards going to come escort him out? What's going to happen? And what broke the silence was Alan Mulally clapping and saying, hey, Mark, this is great visibility. Thank you. Okay, what can we do for Mark, team? And coming up with a whole big plan, right? And that moment, Alan often says that moment, and by the way, the moment the following week when people found out that Mark hadn't been fired, but he was right back at the meeting, right? Slide was still red, but he was right back at the meeting. Those moments of seeing that someone being vulnerable was met with respect instead of disrespect, was met with thank you for being transparent instead of how could you have this problem. That moment was what turned around Ford. I mean, there was a ton of work to do. It took 12 years to get to the point where they were at a $6.6 billion profit when Mulally resigned. But Alan will say that moment, not of somebody being vulnerable, but of the team watching someone be vulnerable, and that vulnerability met with respect from the leader, is what actually convinced them to be honest about their situations, what convinced them and what helped them finally get an accurate picture of what's going on. And that's what turned the company around.
That's awesome. And he started with his first press conference when the journalist asked him.
Yeah. So, I mean, Alan is like a straight shooter, but also a super kind Kansas farm boy, right? It's such an interesting human. And like CEO of the decade, in my opinion, century probably. But his first press, he was committed to calling it like it was, to teach the other leaders to do the same. And so somebody asked him at the very first press conference, hey, what kind of car do you drive, Mr. Mulally? And like, you know where this is going because you read the book. But like, if you're listening, think about your answer. You're the new CEO of Ford Motor Company. So what should you say, right? Should I say an F-150? Should I say a Taurus? What should I say? Alan said, I drive a Lexus. It's the finest car on the market. Imagine, right? Imagine that response. And they very quickly followed up with, that's why I'm excited about Ford. We're not making the finest cars, but we will. And we're going to get a plan to, and we have an opportunity to turn Ford into the maker of the finest cars in the market. Like, I won't say he spun it because he didn't spin it. He talked about what the opportunity was, but the opportunity is only present if you're willing to admit your current state, which is we're not there. And by the way, every other executive at Ford also drove foreign cars, usually Japanese, sometimes European, right? They just didn't admit it. Alan was like, we got to admit where we are if we're going to turn the situation around.
And that's how you create a safe
environment. That's how you teach people how to be safe people, right? You be one to begin with.
Absolutely. David, I could listen to you for hours. Really love that. Obviously, it's a podcast, so we're limited with time. How do people get in touch with you?
So I have been very blessed. I've got a very weird last name. David Burkus, Burkus, there's like me on the internet, and that's it. So if you want to type that into Google, you will find website, you'll find socials, you'll find all sorts of stuff. However you want to connect with me, if you're listening to this, just search the name, you'll find how you want to connect with me, whatever socials you want. And please do, because work is teamwork. That was true for almost all of humanity. That will still be true for the future of human history. And so this is not a conversation that's going to go away anytime soon. We'll be talking about this for a while. And so I'm happy to engage in whatever conversations, questions you have if you're listening to this.
Awesome. Thank you very much, my friend. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Mal, thank you so much for having me.
David, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. Always love hearing you, and the way you tell those stories. It's absolutely amazing. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to connect with me, please do so on LinkedIn or join the Facebook group, eventbusinessformula.com/group. And if you enjoy this conversation, please share it with your network. Thank you. Bye-bye.